I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, just very briefly to set some context. How many of you are from Florida? Hernan, you're the only one from Florida. This might be somebody else. Well, I'm going to do this very quickly. There is no shortage of rail in Florida. I can tell you that for a fact. There's over 37 different railroads, about 3,400 miles of rail existed in Florida. And it isn't, those are the tracks that weren't torn up for rails to trails. Probably the most important part of the entire system, though, at least if you're on Florida's East Coast, is the FEC Railway, the one that runs from Jacksonville, from Miami. It used to go all the way to the Keys, 351 miles of track. We consider it really the next I-95 for Florida. Right now, there are no passengers, and there haven't been passengers on it for about 44 years. We're going to talk today a little bit about how sort of the planets are aligning. There's been a new realignment of policy between the policy agencies like DOT and the federal government about how land use and transportation policies and practices are coming together to almost spur sort of a revival of rail. There is the only existing, so you know, the only existing commuter rail occurs right in this region between Miami and right here in downtown West Palm Beach. That's Tri-Rail. They've been increasing their ridership. They've been around for, what, 17 years now? It was originally a mitigation project for construction on I-95, but people used it so much they've made it a permanent fixture in the landscape. So we're going to also show you some different examples of rail proposals and studies that are underway to get things going along this historic FEC railway, a little bit about some of the TOD work and the preparations that are being made by local governments and the transit agencies and the private sector as well to get prepared for when the trains do start running and they start running passengers. Also, we're going to be talking a little bit about the economic return on investment, or that old question of can dollars rain from trains. And also using some examples from around the country. We have a person with us today I'll introduce just briefly who has been involved in some of the most successful TOD projects in the country, and we'll have some examples for you about why and how they were so successful. I guess the goal of all this, the outcome we hope, will be, that's a picture of Henry Flagler, that he won't have to wait much longer for passengers to get back on the rail again. First I want to introduce a couple of the panelists, our two panelists today. Greg Logan, Managing Director of Robert Charles Lesser in the Orlando office, also Director of Community Development Practice group in that office. Now, Greg's been around a long time, 30 years.
Yeah, the gray hair.
Like me, gray hair. I think the last time I actually saw Greg, I was speaking with him the last time the CNU was in Florida, was in Miami. And I believe I was on a panel with Greg or something like that. I don't remember. But he has 30 years of experience in helping his clients be very successful at what they do, and being the market evaluations and strategic evaluations for residential, commercial, mixed-use projects and developments, town centers and business districts, as well as helping cities, counties, and also community improvement districts develop sort of their economic development strategies so the public and private sector can work together and be successful. Most recently, Greg has been involved, as I said, in a few of the most successful TOD projects in the country, which is why he's here today. It'll be interesting to hear from him. Greg works throughout the country and also a bunch of other places we'd all like to go, like Antigua and Argentina for Hernan, and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Dominican Republic, places like that. So he's well-traveled and widely sought after. His services are widely sought after. Greg's also well-published. I didn't know you did this, but recently for U.S. EPA, and I don't know if it's on the website or not, but there's a white paper that he wrote called The Market for Smart Growth, The Market for Smart Growth. And he currently also chairs ULI's Central Florida District Council, so he's very busy. And he's got to get back for his daughter's volleyball game soon, right? So tomorrow. Our first speaker, actually, though, will be Dr. Kim Delaney. I'm lucky enough and privileged enough to work with Kim at the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. I also have two of my board members in the back. Would you like to stand up? Kevin Foley and Doug Smith from the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. Thank you.
Glad you joined us.
We work for a board. Yeah. No, but you're paying me, so you know. We work for a board. Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council is a board of 28 members, mostly local elected officials, and some appointed by the governor. And those are two of our finest board members. And well, I guess I am just saying that because I'm just kidding. Yeah, so we're good. So, anyways, Kim is the Strategic Development Coordinator for TCRPC, the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, and she's been not one of the lead facilitators, but the lead facilitators with the transportation agencies in Southeast Florida as a sort of shift their thinking and change the minds of folks about transportation and shifting it more towards transit and TOD and things like that. We've made great progress with them. She's also a great resource for the public-private partnerships that are going on in environmental system planning and in education facilities and intergovernmental coordination that the council performs. As I said, without Kim, I don't think we'd be standing here today. I mean that sincerely with the railroad proposals that are being talked about today. She's been instrumental in doing that. Today she's going to address quickly, and I'll sit down because nobody paid to see me. She's going to address regional public policy dialogue in Southeast Florida that, again, has repositioned the whole conversation about transportation. Even some of the most strident transportation engineers that we talk to, especially the county engineers, have realized that because of their shrinking budgets and because of the opinions of their county commissioners or city councils, have begun to sort of put the squeeze on roadway budgets and devote most of the money that they do have, with little gas tax and other money they do have, into transit. So it's been a long time coming, but quite a change, and I believe just recently we've made sort of big advances in that sort of shift in policy. So she's going to talk a little bit about the future TOD investments along the regional rail corridors and transit routes, highlight some of the work that's been completed by the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council in working for agencies like DOT and the transportation authorities and the private sector that own the land along the railroad. And also, again, talk about how this change, this almost paradigm shift in regulatory sort of overview and oversight of where the dollars go has occurred in the region, and to get the region ready really for a strong future related to the transportation that's coming. So, and with that, Kim, thank you so much. Thanks for coming.
Just try to, pardon me for just a moment. There we go. Super. Well, thank you, Michael. And I consider it my good fortune, actually, to have a chance to work with the Regional Planning Council. And I'm still fairly new to the council. I've been there about 7 years, and there's still a new project always on the horizon. So it's just good luck, I think. The planets remained aligned to let that opportunity happen. My part of the presentation is going to cover mobility in Southeast Florida, and particularly how to leverage transportation dollars into land development activity. I mean, for those of you who are in Florida, and this is not just the trend in Florida but nationwide, transportation dollars are always the leverage that leads private sector investment. So the better job we can do with that, the better predictability we can have going forward as to getting the patterns that we want. I don't mean to tease with my slide here, my intro slide. Florida's been through some tough decision making in the last 24 months or so. We're not moving towards using wagon trains, which is a good thing, but there's maybe a threat of that for a little while. But we have a lot of mobility options, and hopefully we avoid that image on your top right, which is the character of some of the major roadways we have in the region. What's going on in Southeast Florida? Again, our council is focused in Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Miami-Dade counties, but we work all the way south with Broward, Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River counties. But we work to the south with the 3 southern counties in Broward, Miami-Dade, and Monroe. So a lot of the work focuses on the 7-county Southeast Florida region. In that part of the country, the Texas Transportation Institute, of course, produces an annual report that looks at congestion on the roadway network, on the transportation network. And those figures are generated beyond what you would expect the normal commute to be. So if you're supposed to have a 45-minute commute but it takes you an hour, they count that 15 minutes towards the congestion inventory, essentially, for that part of the country. In our part of the state, we waste about 140 million hours a year sitting in traffic, $3.2 billion based on lost productivity. The FEC corridor that Michael just talked about just sold to Rail America 4 years ago for $3.1 billion. So every year we're losing the opportunity costs for just significant infrastructure investment. And their information, of course, is online if you want to check the stats for your part of the country as well. But Florida's demographics are pretty, are pretty positive. We're not going to have an Ohio winter, and we're not going to have a Michigan winter. And Florida's population trends are recovering now and actually projecting maybe an $18 to $20 million increase through 2060. So what that means is we have a transportation network that has some constraint. These slides are actually from FDOT, the Department of Transportation, which just finished the 2060 plan. And so using the most recent numbers they had in that inventory, 2009, this map shows the state's roadway network where we have heavily congested corridors as of 2009. When those numbers were forecast to 2035, what the state found when it looked at its own transportation network was that pretty much every major metro area of the state will be in complete gridlock. There's not enough money to build the roadway capacity necessary to move people. It's about a $53 billion shortfall actually to accomplish this level of congestion, which is what's forecast at build-out essentially. So if we don't want this to be the only option that we have, and by the way, one of the questions we ask is, well, gosh, why are the roads so crowded? We have a limit on the number of options, but what we're doing as a population, particularly in Florida, is driving more because we don't have those options. So as the population grows, for example, a 53% increase in the population in the region over 20 years, the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, actually is almost doubling that at 90%. So we're growing more but driving more at the same time, kind of digging a hole deeper. Pardon me. And when you look at FDOT's own figures, what you find is FDOT is short-funded and can't expand the roadway network and wouldn't have the dollars to do it even if the right-of-way was available. In fact, in the Southeast Florida region, the most recent numbers I have from the folks at the FDOT district are that the population is forecast over the next roughly 20 years to grow about 80%. The roadway network is going to expand about 40%. So if you think it's crowded today, the future is obviously a little tighter. And so the big question that we have at the Regional Planning Council, what we look at is how are we going to settle the next 10 or 20 million people in a landscape like this, where we have a real limit on those options. And so what we've learned in talking to the local governments and heard from the local governments and the citizens and developers in the region is we're well into a paradigm shift at this point. And the agencies are really the ones, the transportation planning agencies are the ones that are acknowledging this and starting to lead a new direction with their own investment strategies. We know we don't have good predictability. Gas is now back to just about $4 a gallon. When we were doing some charrette work a few years ago in Palm Beach Gardens, we were interviewing business owners in the community to kind of understand how the roadway network impacted their ability to do business. When gas was $4 then, they were telling us they were putting $25 gas cards in paychecks to get people to drive to work. These were the owners of Dunkin' Donuts, the owners of Hampton Inn, for service sector employees. So it's not a predictable pattern when that's what it takes to actually get your employees back and forth to work. We also, of course, know that green is heavily on the agenda, and carbon emissions and climate change conditions are particularly poignant in Southeast Florida. It's a very popular topic of dialogue. What we know is looking at commuter rail systems and bus systems are significant ways to reduce the carbon footprint. When we zoom out of Southeast Florida and look around the country, what we find is that successful regions that we try to model have successful and expanding transit networks. Successful states also, competitive states, are investing in transit systems. And zooming out even further, when we look around the world, what we find is all the major GDP producers are putting 50 to 60% of all future dollars, all future transportation dollars into rail networks. And so we have a catch-up game to play, but to land at a place where we're competitive down the road, certainly it's a message the Regional Planning Council has heard. And so what we've found is that through the MPOs, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations in the region, those entities are starting to invest their federal, state, and local transportation dollars into improvements that will build a better transit network going forward and hopefully readjust land use patterns so that we can get the synchronization that we need between land use and transportation to make it work. In Martin and St. Lucie counties, which just adopted their 20-year long-range transportation plan, those two governmental entities are putting $76 million into retrofit projects to improve conditions on US 1, which is the major roadway leading through those two counties, and an additional $12 million in livable communities projects, all designed to leverage transportation investments to improve land use patterns. It becomes more significant when you look further to the south at the three counties that make up the Southeast Florida Transportation Council. Their 20-year budget is about $58 billion. 61% of those dollars are going to go into transit. So that's a $35.5 billion leverage of land use. That creates a lot of opportunity. We do have a challenging terrain, and this slide illustrates the layers and layers of different agencies that are responsible for essentially integrating the transportation and land use playing field. And so between the MPOs, the transportation councils, the regional planning councils, the local governments, the transit agencies, and then not to be lost, the citizens, the developers, and the stakeholders that are going to use that system, there are challenges to be had, and it takes a lot of navigating and a lot of trust in the other agencies to commit to projects that might not have an immediate turn for your agency, but long-term are better for the region. Pardon me. Florida does have a passenger rail vision, which was adopted back in 2009, and so the state has identified those major rail corridors that are all being looked at for future passenger rail long-term. In Southeast Florida, there's actually, if you're a transit advocate like I am, it's a very rewarding time because in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been an increasing emphasis in passenger rail in the region. We have existing facilities, but there hasn't been as consistent a focus on turning them into passenger rail as in the last few years. Just to illustrate what's going on, the purple line is the CSX corridor, which lies to the west of I-95. So if you used Tri-Rail on any part of your trip, Tri-Rail runs on CSX. That carries Amtrak service today, which pardon me, runs west to Tampa and north to Jacksonville. In addition, the CSX corridor that the FEC corridor that Michael talked about runs along the east coast of Florida. It interconnects all the historic downtowns in Florida. It's actually how the state was developed initially. The whole east coast was opened up by Henry Flagler bringing his rail line down and building station after station along the rail line all the way down ultimately to Key West. That line is under review today for long-distance service in the form of Amtrak, as well as Tri-Rail service today runs on the CSX, which is commuter rail, and I'll talk about each of these different rail services in a moment. And then there's future commuter rail forecast both on the CSX and FEC through all of Southeast Florida, which is putting passenger service back on the FEC. And finally, the FEC Industries, which owns the rail line, just announced in the last 2 months future high-speed express service called the All Aboard Florida project that would actually be a private investment of $1 billion that would run express service with 3 stations in the region, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm in each of the downtowns, and then a terminal station in Orlando, future stations being extended to Tampa and Jacksonville. So in terms of rail opportunity, there's a lot underway in the region, which is very promising. The question that we hear from the development community is, how long is it really going to take, and are the agencies going to stay together to make these investments happen? The FEC opportunity provides probably the nearest term opportunity. The FEC is indicating within 3 years. It intends to put $1 billion investment to get the first piece of passenger rail underway. That's really a watershed in the region if that's able to happen, because it opens the FEC up for passenger rail service. The first of those improvements to kind of get into the details about is the FEC Amtrak proposal, which is proposed to put Amtrak service on the FEC corridor between Jacksonville and West Palm Beach, interconnect those 2 corridors in West Palm, and then bring service down into Miami. There are 8 new stations proposed on the corridor, and they're listed there: St. Augustine, Daytona, Titusville, Cocoa, Melbourne, Vero Beach, Fort Pierce, and Stewart. they all had original stations, and those are all towns that grew up around those stations. So the land use pattern is in good shape. There are TODs missing the T now, unfortunately, so it just puts the T back in those places and has a chance to reactivate those stations. This project's actually funded in the FDOT work program, $118 million programmed, available in July of next year. So there's a lot of optimism about this project happening fairly quickly. There's a great history along the corridor. As I mentioned, all of Florida was opened up with FEC service coming down from Jacksonville. We don't have many of these historic stations left. Only Jacksonville, Vero Beach, and Titusville remain, actually. But they're in the right location. They're still on the track. And so those are opportunities for essentially adaptive reuse. They've become storage and industrial buildings, but they're still there. And the other stations are going to be built new. The Regional Planning Council helped FDOT and all the local governments in developing station plans for each of the communities. The one I chose to use is in Vero Beach, where they have actually an existing station that was relocated from another part of the track and plunked down in the heart of the downtown. And so the before image is on the top, the after at the bottom. This type of service, which is Amtrak Intercity Passenger Rail, is a very limited infrastructure investment to accommodate Amtrak service, but the economic yield that happens from all of a sudden having a train station and people come off and on is about a $2 billion impact along the corridor. We've helped all the communities up and down the coast with station planning in each of the locations. And again, those local governments have taken these plans and begun to implement them in their own comprehensive plans, land development regulations, and each MPO along the coast has adopted the project into its plan to set it up for the FDOT's dollars to be invested. Tri-Rail is the existing commuter rail service, the only operational commuter rail that we have in the state today. Sunrail is a commuter rail that's coming on the heels of it that'll come into Orlando in about 2 years. Tri-Rail runs 18 stations along 72 miles, carries about 15,000 people a day, which is almost a lane of traffic on I-95, just to give you an idea of perspective. Tri-Rail runs in 3 counties and has a board that's governed by elected officials and gubernatorial appointees. An example project for the Tri-Rail corridor, which has really been trying to understand land use patterns along its existing stations, is in West Palm Beach, actually, which is just right down the street. We helped facilitate a multi-agency charrette back in 2005 and came up with developed a master plan to redevelop this area around the train station. If you can imagine, when you get off the train today, it looks like this, and the proposal for future redevelopment is much more intense. In fact, doing interviews in this project, I talked to some owners of a bed and breakfast that's 3 blocks away from the train station, and they told me they market heavily to European travelers who want to fly into Miami and take the train up. So they take the train up, and the owners of the B&B, which is again 3 blocks away, tell them you can just wheel your luggage and come right to the hotel. And they get off the train and they look at this and they say, where the hell am I? And they call a cab and they go 3 blocks to get to the bed and breakfast. That's almost you can almost hit a golf ball there. If you're Kevin, you can hit a golf ball there. So the infill pattern that we developed through the charrette is about 1 million square feet of public office space, which is proposed for the district, in addition to, at the time, the market really wanted residential. So we had about 2,000 residential units programmed. Since the charrette completed in 2005 and the market conditions have changed, the development community is really looking at office use coming into this district today. Now, it's been a little while. 2005, I had just started with the council. I had a 1-year-old who's now almost 9. What has taken place? What's the delay? It sure looks good. It looks like it makes a lot of sense. The challenge with this district is that most of the land is in public hands. So there's not a natural profit motivation. If this was in the private sector's hands, the project would have been developed when the lending institutions were set up to make it happen. But unfortunately, in this condition, most of the land ownership is owned by the state, the feds, or different state agencies, or the county. And so it's taken an enormous effort to bring those pieces together to package the public uses on a small enough amount of land to get some of the public land into production so it can be redeveloped. That said, the negotiations are underway with the county for the first piece to happen, which is the wedge parcel, which you can see illustrated on the top part of this image. And we're hoping, knock on wood, it's going to be, those negotiations will be completed within about a year. So the Southeast Florida corridor, the South Florida East Coast Corridor Study is a commuter rail proposal that's been planned for the two rail corridors, CSX and FEC, for about the past 8 years. Pardon me. What this commuter rail package offers is an opportunity to run express service with fewer stations, longer distance, like tri-rail runs, probably on the CSX, and then more of a local service on the FEC, where there's really a very heavy intensity of destinations. You could actually accommodate maybe 50 or 60 stations that could all have market share. Too much to do in a first phase, but that's how much density there is for TOD opportunity along the 85-mile corridor that's represented by this project. It's a 20-year horizon. It's about a $2.5 billion build-out. So clearly it has to be broken down into bite-sized pieces. Pardon me. The SFRTA, which runs Tri-Rail, has actually come out with its own proposal, which would suggest that this project could be built with just state dollars, not even pursue federal dollars, but use just state dollars to put a first phase online. And so we're actually assisting both of those agencies to try to figure out how to come together. It's caused a little tension in the region because FDOT has moved a bit in one direction and the SFRTA in another, but there's no blood on the ground yet, which is a good thing. And we're optimistic that we'll have a, as my friend Randy Woodfield, who's the MPO director here, says, we'll have a common track. We'll have a single track going forward for these agencies to agree to get commuter rail underway, potentially within a 3 to 5 year time frame. We've done a lot of land planning work along this corridor, which doesn't have train service today, so these are future station opportunities. The first one's up in the town of Jupiter. Jupiter is a fairly small town. It's got a population of about 25,000. No, I'm sorry, 50,000, but a small scale, 2 to 4 story scale. It's at the northern end of Palm Beach County. Back in 2008, we conducted an interagency charrette. Okay, I was looking for my 10-minute mark, but that's okay. We looked at five opportunities for stations and recommended 3 going forward. The one that's illustrated here is Tony Penna Drive, which is by the Jupiter Medical Center. It's the town's major employer. It has about 1,400 employees and about 1 million square feet of medical office within 3/4 of a mile of the station location. And so if you take an existing condition that looks like this, and you do the right things in working with FDOT, the county, and the town in making public investments in the right place, you can create a transit-supportive complete street, and then ideally you have codes that are drafted to enable the right scale of redevelopment to come in. In fact, since the charrette's been completed, we've been working directly with the town to revise the town's land development regulations to create an overlay zone to direct redevelopment into a transit-supportive pattern in this district. Gotcha. And so some images of what the stations. Yeah, it's all right. Okay, you got it. Going faster. In Lake Worth, we facilitated a charrette in the town of Lake Worth, which is located about 20 minutes south. In this location, there were 2 stations that were looked at for future station potential. Most likely, the first one that will happen is in the heart of the downtown. If you can imagine, Lake and Lucerne Avenues are a one-way pair that connect to I-95 to the west and to the ocean at the east end. And there's a historic main street that lives between the 2 of those. This very large beverage distribution facility, which has a 1-story metal building on it, really screams TOD potential when you're looking up and down the corridor. And so in this location, we actually recommended a station in that spot, and actually the opportunity for additional mixed-use development to take place to the latter, with still enough room for the beverage distribution uses to continue going forward. In West Palm Beach, right across the street in the downtown, the future station location is recommended at City Place. Rosemary Avenue is the avenue that runs right down the center of City Place, and this is the theater and Panera. If you're familiar with Panera, if you've been into City Place, this is that street. Before and after images of how you can very easily integrate a station in unused land that can't be developed for anything else. No parking necessary because there's 1,400 spaces in City Place already with additional parking, additional city parking in the area. And another image of that station before and after. And this location is being evaluated by the FEC for its long-distance commuter service that's going to have just 4 stations, West Palm, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Orlando. So this may be a very significant intermodal hub going forward with local service and express service running long distance. And finally, in the city of Palm Beach Gardens, which is at the northern part of the region, Palm Beach Gardens is a regional destination for mostly for shopping and entertainment in really an unparalleled form. It has a market area of 75 miles, has more than 3 million feet of retail space along PGA Boulevard, which is consolidated in a few individual uses. There's a very large mall, which is Forbes Mall, the Gardens Mall, some lifestyle centers that have come in over time that are kind of retail, dining, entertainment destinations. There's a community college down the street and a hospital with about 3 million feet of biotech. So it's really a major destination in the region, but one that's been very hard to serve by transit. So we were asking the Charette to help understand why is transit so tough to make happen here. So we took a stroll on a Sunday. Notice there's not a sidewalk there, so that's a takeaway, right? And this is Bob Gibbs, who's a good friend who comes on Charette with us often. We developed, we thought a figure ground would be an appropriate way to better understand what's happening there. And you all are familiar with figure grounds. There are some times when it takes a little explanation for folks to understand that. But of course, it's a Noli plan. So the plan for Rome, of course, is a famous Noli plan. Barcelona and Paris. West Palm Beach has a figure ground that was developed, this is about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Clematis Street is pretty clearly identified by the buildings that frame it. City Place, of course, forming kind of a set of urban blocks. A lot of opportunity left, frankly, in downtown West Palm. But what's there today is really established a great, comfortable network for walking and transit. Delray Beach, also a city about 30 minutes to the south. Atlantic Avenue, very easily formed by the figure ground in Delray. So in Palm Beach Gardens, we tried to understand what was happening. And there wasn't a lot to draw because there wasn't a lot there. So to be fair, we went ahead and filled in the very significant retention areas and landscape areas, berms mostly, that were in the vicinity. But really the dominant feature is the parking. And so as a takeaway, as we're analyzing transit supportive conditions going forward, this is one of the layers that we've started to use, is just a parking layer to understand why everything is so blown out. We did find a great opportunity for a future station, actually, which is right along A1A and PGA Boulevard there. And we're working with FP&L, which is moving its headquarters to that location, who's very interested in having a station there to help move their 2,000 employees up from Miami and Fort Lauderdale into Palm Beach Gardens to work. Certainly a good opportunity for investment. So with that, 4.5 minutes.
That's good.
Thank you. I'll be here for questions after.
Yeah, we'll do questions after.
There you go. Okay. Oh, those are my kids and dog. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I thought I had gotten it open.
You did. I messed with it. You messed with it. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. That was great. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the real estate side. And I thought I would talk about the consumer marketplace, what's happening now, and obviously it's kind of a snapshot in time, but who's out in the market, what are they saying they're looking for, and how does that relate to the opportunity to create transit-oriented development? And then look at some evidence we have from other places in the country about what has been the contribution to value. And again, I'm coming at this from a real estate perspective. What kind of value has been created because of the investments in transit that have been made in other places, and what does that imply here? And then look at some specific case studies, both some case studies of places that seem to have had a lot going for them, as well as some places that maybe were a little more challenged. We've had the good fortune of working with CATS, the Charlotte Area Transit System, on some of their work going back to the planning of the Northern Line there and siting stations. We had an opportunity to work with MARTA in Atlanta on one of the early fairly large-scale transit-oriented developments, the Lindbergh MARTA station, working there with the city, with MARTA, with Bell South, who ended up putting their headquarters there, with Carter & Associates, who was the developer who actually built it. And then working in D.C., both with Metro and then with a lot of different private landowners around Metro stations. And I'm actually going to use some of the D.C. examples, even though I've been criticized for showing some of those. Some people say, well, gee, that's Washington, D.C., that's different, it's a real dense place, how applicable are those? And I think that that what we miss is that Metro actually got started, back in the 1970s, and that actually the conditions when that was started and the densities of some of the places that Kim was just showing really were not that different. In fact, in some of the places that have experienced a lot of success were fairly challenged at that point in time. And I think one of the reasons why Metro is a good example, Charlotte's a good example too. Bard out in Northern California is a good example. MARTA is a good example, but they're examples for different reasons. One of the reasons why Metro is a good example is it's one that's been fairly fully committed to. And I think what it shows is that when you make a bigger commitment to transit and it gets fully funded and you have the trains that run on a regular enough schedule that they can be relied upon and you can actually get from the station to the places that you're going, that you have a lot of success. And then some of the other cases where we've worked, for example, with MARTA, it's had some success, but it's been more limited, and that's a good example of a region that didn't really fully commit and sort of became somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy of, see, it's not quite working. Well, yeah, you didn't quite actually fully commit to making it work. And so I think they're good examples for that reason. So that's kind of an overview of where we're going to go and then talk about what we think the lessons learned are and how the lessons from those places might be applied. So starting off with thinking about the consumer marketplace. This is, you see a lot of surveys about what people want, and Gen X says they all want to live here, or Gen Y says they want to live there. And those are all very interesting surveys, and people look at the numbers of people in those surveys and they say, gee, there's so many Gen Ys that's really going to have a huge impact, and yes, it certainly will. But what we've tried to do in some of this stuff is let's look at what people have said in surveys, and let's look at who's actually out there on the market. So, for example, Generation Y, 22% of them actually had households right now, and so that increases by about 12% a year. So they will have a bigger and bigger impact. Right now, when you look at some of the statistics of where they are, they're not just living at home with mom and dad because they had to move back because of the recession. Some of them are living at home with mom and dad because they're 10 years old and they don't have jobs. And I say put them to work. So this is oh yes, sure. So this is looking at the active markets. Who's actually out there in the market looking for places to live? And so you see on the renter households, Gen Y is a big part of that. You look at the owner households, Gen Y not so much. Really, Gen X still can't get any respect, but they are the biggest share of the for sale housing market, followed by the boomers and the Eisenhowers. We salute you. So this is where owner households are living now, and this is sort of broken down by generation. And what you see is this is where they're living now of people who participated in a large survey that the National Association of Realtors did about where you want to live, and just focusing on those that are actually active in the market right now looking for a place to rent or own. And you see an awful lot of them are either in suburban neighborhoods, housing-only areas, suburban mixed areas, or urban areas of cities, residential areas, a fair amount in rural as well, kind of spread out all over, an awful lot in a suburban setting. This is looking at where the owner households of those that are active in the market say they want to live. And what's really interesting is you see a jump up in city downtown. You see a really big spike in suburban mixed areas, and not a whole lot saying I want to live in a suburban housing only area. A fair number of people who say I'm getting out of here, I'm headed to the rural area. So a little bit of everything. The interesting thing about the suburban mixed is that people seem to be saying is we'd really like suburban areas that are suburban scale. We really want them to function more like cities. We want more convenience. We want more services. We like to be closer to jobs. We're not sure we want to move downtown yet. Then we look at the renters. These are a lot of our younger households, but looking at who the renters are, that cuts across all generations. Gen X, a big part of that renter household market as well, and even some baby boomers. So where do the renters say they want to be? Big jump up now, and want to be in a downtown area of a city or the residential area of a city. Also wanting to be in more of a suburban mixed area, closer to, with more services and shopping and commercial development and closer to employment, not so much in the suburban neighborhood only area or small town or rural. And what's interesting about that, and again, this is looking at a point in time, but that really, this is where a lot of the development activity is right now, as we're seeing the resurgence and the demand for rental housing, and we have this big generation, this 80 million generation of Gen Ys who are now, 22% of them had households. That will continue increasing by about 12% a year for many years to come. They are about 80% of them, when they first started graduating from college, were renters. That's dropped down to about 70% now. And as they mature and increasingly become household heads, more of them are going to want to own as well. When you look at the kinds of housing products that they say they want, and you look at the youngest households, the 18 to 29, a lot more of them, about 21%, say I'd like to be in a townhouse, an apartment, or a condo than the older generations. So that is a shift, partly reflecting where they are in their life. In the survey, they were also asked in deciding, this is looking at the whole market now, deciding where to live, how important are different things that you'd like to have with an easy walk, very important, somewhat important, not at all important. And you can see that about 50% said transportation by bus was either very important or somewhat important, by rail about 42%. And then wanting to be close to a lot of things that you do on a daily basis, like go to the grocery store or eat, and having that close by.
What was the 50%?
Sorry?
What did that stand for? 50%
Is the combined very important and somewhat important. And I'll answer questions at the end if you like, but it's the combination of very important and somewhat important. And this is just, I had maybe 100 things on the list. This is looking at those things that were the top things that they said. Overall, we looked at transit preference by age, and that same survey of where, and again, the question is, where would you like to live when you move? So this is just looking at that active segment of the market. About a quarter of the market overall, you can see among the younger households, 18 to 34, that's about 26%, falls off at the age 70 plus, and somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the 20s. We also looked at it by income and found lower income about 26%, but high and middle both in the 20% range of people who'd like that. And again, we're talking about millions of households here, so much smaller numbers of those people's needs are being met in terms of what they're saying they really like. So the takeaway from this is that there's tremendous interest in places that are more mixed use, that are more walkable, that have more amenities, that are closer to jobs, that have transit. Many more people who would like to have that than currently are experiencing that. Well, I said we'd look at some case studies. Sort of the bottom line of a lot of the case studies we've looked at is that it has a very positive impact on real estate, and an opportunity when we think about creating transit-oriented developments is how do we capture that value increase, and can we use that capture to help fund some of the things that would like to happen around these transit-oriented developments. But we find that properties, this is talking about streetcar, and we'll look at premiums and impacts on different kinds of transit in a minute. But overall, we find that the value of those properties increases, and that the value of those properties can be captured in a tax increment finance district or a tax allocation district, depending on what state you're from or what it's called. And that can be captured and used to help pay for some of the things. Bonds can be issued that are repaid through those increments. That the developments that are built near those investments derive either rent or price premiums from the market as a reflection of how the market values those things. And that underutilized properties that are close to those investments often over time, sometimes it's relatively quickly, sometimes it occurs over a 20-year period, but are often upzoned, rezoned, upgraded with higher intensity uses leading to higher property values, which is a reflection of how the market desires those places and also helps to pay for that. In a lot of the case studies we've looked at of different kinds of transit, BRT is typically not done as well as where there's a fixed rail, and that partly has to do with the private sector's willingness to go and invest in something that they're, if you haven't plunked down a whole lot of money and created something that's fixed that they know you're not going to move, the station's actually there, and it's harder to move because the rail is there. That has tended to attract more of the investment than BRT has. This is an interesting case study, though, out of in the Eugene area where this particular BRT has done very well in terms of attracting a lot of employment. And when you look at sort of what the fair share of employment would have been within a quarter mile of the BRT stations in Eugene, they did a really good job of exceeding that. About 42% of jobs in the 04 to 2010 period ended up locating close to the BRT stations and across a wide range of different kinds of firms who were attracted to that. So from an economic development perspective, it's been positive from an impact on property values, not as much as on the fixed rail. When we look at how that value creation typically works, this is sort of a cartoon of that, of how those values grow from when the transit is announced to when it opens, to when it expands, when it's certain that the funding sources are there, that there's a ramp-up time for that value creation. And obviously, when you want to put in something like a TIF or a TAD or how you're going to be paying for that, thinking about where that basis starts is really important so that value can be captured. This is looking at the Portland streetcar, and if you can see, this is where the line is, and then the green and blue would be lower values, and where you see the reds and orange is where the values had increased. Basically what this shows is that the value multiplier around the stations overall, it varied a little bit depending on also where there were really positive market forces at work in addition to the rail, but about a 70 times value multiplier with some properties increasing by over 400% from the time that the streetcar was the land was first valued to when the streetcar was put in. Similar in looking at Tampa from downtown through the Channelside district to Ybor City, and then looking in Seattle at those similar impacts. And depending on the time frame, some properties in the 200 to 300% and as much as 400% increase. So this is an attempt to look at a lot of different case studies. Some of ours in the D.C. area, from where we worked with Metro, and then some from all over wherever we could find them, to sort of put together a compilation of what do we know from some of the different case studies of what have been the value impacts. And you can see apartments on light rail, anywhere from very little impact to as much as a 40% impact. BRT, not so much impact. Condominium, historically so far, and partly that has to do with the fact that condominiums have had the stuffing kicked out of them in the last cycle, and we're looking at some of these things, but fairly modest impact. In the D.C. area, as much as a 20% impact on condominium values, transit premium in the different market areas where we've looked around different stations. For office, light rail office is almost an 80% premium around transit, around light rail. Commuter rail, over an 80%. And again, the variation when we look at the case studies of why do we have such a variation sort of depends on where are we. Transit certainly has a big impact on value creation. Again, you have to be in the right place that also that people want to be and have other market fundamentals supporting that as well. Which is what we found when we were working on the Charlotte system and thinking about where they would put stations is that not only did it make an impact that you had the investment in transit there, but you were also thinking about how other market forces were working and could be harnessed. BRT office does a little better than other land uses, somewhere around a 10% impact, and then looking in around some of the metro stations and some of our recent work at around 22%. But overall, across that, pretty good premiums. We've looked at this data. We're working in Atlanta right now on the Beltline project and thinking about what the value creation potential could be. So this is just from some of our analysis of looking at these different case studies and how we would apply it for where we think the values are, where the impacts would be. Large lot, single family, not a whole lot of impact on the one hand. Small lot, clustered, single family, pretty big impact, and somewhere in the 15 to 20% impact on most other uses based on looking at how we think the market will play out and where the stations are going and how that will work in Atlanta with the Beltline project. We've done a lot of analysis in D.C. and used a lot of GIS to try and understand what kinds of companies have been attracted to locate around metro stations. So this is looking within about a half mile of metro stations in the D.C. area, and we've found on average about 3,500 households and about a little over 1,000 businesses. And we've looked at that in different places outside the district, looking in Montgomery District, Bethesda being the first stop outside the district, on out to Shady Grove and Rockdale. Around 800 businesses within a half mile of metro, about 2,700 households. And on the Virginia side, the south side of the district, on average about 500 businesses, 3,600 households locating within about a half a mile of a metro station. And again, thinking back that we have looked at this over time, and I'll show you some case studies of that. Thinking back that this started in the 70s, some of these places were fairly low density at that time. Bethesda is one that you might say, well, gee, that's a great neighborhood, fairly high-end, wonderful place, Bethesda Row. Full disclosure, our office is there. I'm in our Orlando office, but our Bethesda office is right next to the Bethesda station, which is great for me when I go visit. But having Metro there has really helped make this an even better place. That there's a lot of the higher density development that's happened in the Bethesda area, really followed when the station was completed in 1984, and a lot of really nice combination of office, retail, and residential development.
Sorry.
She's coughing.
Long time.
Okay, I thought maybe
But it does mean 10 minutes.
Okay,
I was
make sure my time
It's a
wasn't
double
up.
indicator.
Okay.
Choking in time.
So I've looked at what's happened with ridership, and ridership has increased. And a lot of nice transit-oriented development. It is a more upscale kind of an area, and so obviously it had a lot of very positive market forces working with it. We looked at Gallery Place, where you can see that the Chinatown area in D.C., that station where ridership just from 2000 to 2009 grew by about 15,000. This, if you go back to the 1990s, this was a fairly desolate stretch of a lot of boarded up buildings and an old storefronts that has sort of come and gone. They had some other catalysts, and I think that it's interesting to think about how the investment in transit here was also combined with other investments in other catalysts, like the Verizon Center, which opened in '97, the National Portrait Gallery being renovated. And so when you think about where you want things to happen, and you don't have those market forces going for you, which this area clearly did not, it needed some other catalysts to help spur that along. But it's had just phenomenal growth, a lot of growth in households, increasing to close to 5,000 households. Just within a half a mile of the metro. It was about 1,500 households, then a half a mile in 1990. That's grown to about 5,000 households, a lot of high-intensity development there, quite a lot of other development. It's really become kind of a cool entertainment and retail district that people would like to go. And you look at it today and you say, well, sure, yeah, it works just fine, but if you saw it in the 1990s, you'd really be impressed. New York Avenue is another one that has sort of been a rebranding effort. What's interesting about this area is the amount of public and private sector investment. This is an area where a lot of private sector investment has been leveraged to make things happen since 1990. You can see that the growth rate in the 90 to 2000 era was a negative 1.6, and in the 2000s grew at a pretty healthy rate of close to 5%. And even during the recession has continued to do much better as a result of this collaboration of public and private sector funds that have enabled a lot of transit-oriented development within a half mile of that metro station. Columbia Heights is another area, sort of the anti-Bethesda, or the opposite of Bethesda. It was a very challenged area. It was the place with the riots back in the 1960s. Really didn't experience a whole lot of revitalization until the metro station opened, and has been on a fairly steady uphill trajectory since then. You can see in the 90s it was growing at less than 1%, and in the 2000s bumped up over 5%, and again through the recession continued to grow. They've had a lot of very positive political will to make things happen. They've had a number of different public-private partnerships there to capitalize on the investment in transit. And you can see that the ridership has grown dramatically from about 3,900 riders to over 11,000. And it's just attracted a whole lot of investment, over 500,000 square feet of retail there now. What are some of the things that have been done? Certainly making the full commitment to transit has had a big impact when we look at places like Charlotte and Metro, and even BART in Northern California compared to the Atlanta area. But creating business improvement districts, self-taxing districts, creating TAD or TIF areas, commercial TIFs, and capitalizing on that value increase. Making sure you have the right zoning in place, the right mixed-use zoning, entering into joint development where it's not necessarily a joint venture, but where you're planning the transit investment and working with the private sector entities who are going to come in and do the commercial and residential development, so that they're designed in a way to capitalize on that transit investment. The public-private partnerships, enterprise zones, those are all some of the things that have been utilized to try and get more out of that transit investment. The bottom line is a substantial share of growth will trend towards transit-oriented development if we have that full commitment and capitalize on those funding opportunities and create those public-private partnerships or joint development agreements. There's tremendous value that can be realized in creating those kinds of places. Both jobs and people are attracted to those kinds of environments. We've seen from even the National Association of Realtors that a lot more people are looking for those kinds of environments than live there now. Obviously, it's a very difficult task. It's kind of mind-blowing looking at Kim's slide on all the different agencies that you have to coordinate with just on the transit side, let alone the real estate side. But it seems that it's very important to our economic future to be thinking along those lines. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions if you'd like. Anybody have any questions? There.
I have a question for Richard, for Greg. A lot of those photos of the transit-oriented development areas around the ecosystem of Metro and DC. I thought I saw a lot of what appeared to be like multi-level parking garages. Is that true?
There may be. Yeah. So is everyone driving, or is everyone riding the train? Kind of varies by area in terms of what the mode is. In some places you've seen the parking requirements changed, reduced, not eliminated, but parking requirements eliminated, and that has also been very helpful in funding some of those developments, when you can convince the developer can convince the lender that we will be able to get by with less parking, and that will take some costs out of the project. So. But I've not done an analysis of those whole areas to figure out
just
how much.
So
yeah.
in a sense, it's almost like these are Neanderthal kind of TODs compared to what could happen in the future in terms of having the land use area more productive with less dedication to parking.
I don't know. I think there's some pretty cool TODs in there. You know, I
Let's
think
call them
that
early
maybe-
TODs.
Yeah. You know, do you? You know, we worked on the Lindbergh MARTA, and it was very hard. It was very difficult at that time to, you know, when you do a development project, it's not just that the city wants something to happen or even the developer wants something to happen. You also have to convince the money who's going to invest in it. And that was probably one of the biggest challenges we had at that time. That goes back some years, was convincing the lenders that you actually could reduce the parking requirements and people would still do it. And they're able to do that, and that is a trend. So.
Yes.
This is for Greg, but it may also apply. Was it Kim?
Yep.
One of the things you mentioned was increasing zoning around the transit stations. We're seeing in Atlanta a lot of speculation based on future upzonings. And we've had a lot of developer clients tell us that in anticipation of transit, the worst thing to do is to increase the zoning because it raises values and the deals don't work. I'd be very curious if any of you have had that issue and thought about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. The time to go in and be buying the property obviously is early on before the transit comes in. At MARTA, how long has MARTA been in place?
30 years.
So chances are people know transit is coming. Yeah, around the Beltline. Yeah, I think that's a challenge. I think ultimately in negotiations, the value of the land is dependent on the use that you're going to put there. And you can't sell the land for more than the uses you're going to put there will support. And so that ultimately, in most of the actual negotiations I've been involved in, everybody has to agree on what that land value is. And if it gets to be unsupported, the landowner is going to be disappointed because the developer or lender is not going to end up buying the site based on that if it's unrealistic.
And just with the experience that we've had, in some instances we've recommended time-limited density increases because you want to pull the market faster than it might want to come. And another technique that helps is a minimum 2-story or a minimum 4-story, because if the building is the right building and you get what you want and the transit comes later, that's okay. So it's really a balance of compelling the market maybe before it wants to come or before it wants to bring a certain use, but pushing the market to bring the form that you want. Because if a transit supportive place is really just a well-designed urban environment, right? Every transit trip starts and stops as a pedestrian. So the development community here, let me flip that. The municipal community here is so hungry for development right now because it's the inbox that used to be this high now has, in some cases, a little dust. That it's a very tenuous time, honestly, because you don't want to give away the farm and get the wrong use, because then you're stuck with that. But at the same time, we have so much land opportunity from a development standpoint in Florida that you have to really use, I think, the regulatory incentive carefully to get what you want in the right form, but prevent the use that you don't want to be stuck with, if that makes some sense.
Right here, and then we still have time. Go ahead.
I'm a native Charlottean, but have just moved to Florida.
Charlottean. Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you. I am starting to work with urban design and transportation. And I'm seeing some examples in Charlotte, which seems to me to be an example here of stations that, we operate on such a big picture. And then when we come down to the station, there are stations in Charlotte on the light rail that don't even have pedestrian connections into the neighborhood that abut them. The whole station faces towards an enormous parking lot, and it's been built around the car. And so I just want to know, what can we do in Florida so that doesn't happen? I see the plans for Sunrail, and it's just like swarming in parking lots. And when we get down to that little scale and make sure there are the pedestrian connections, that we are doing traffic calming across these large corridors that they're often on, because otherwise they're not going to reach their full potential, it seems.
You want to speak to that?
Yeah, you all go first. You can. I think you're absolutely right. I think that unfortunately, some agencies still see their role as being primarily about the transportation part, and in terms of the planning that gets done, they'll think that far through. And I think we can always do a better job of thinking about the bigger picture, what could happen. I would share your concern about some of the Sunrail that having a station in a parking lot is not going to get us there. So.
You're right in that a micro focus on the station really, kind of for the one you lose the perspective on what's going on around it. One of the things that we did with Palm Beach County, actually related to zoning, was help them adjust their concurrency regulations, which were really the restriction on allowing development to go forward. Too much traffic generated on the roadway network, so the projects would sit and not be able to develop. In exchange for that permission or that flexibility required the developer to help the county develop a station area plan that looked at all the uses within a quarter mile, to avoid that very issue, because the site the market wants to develop and connect to the station isn't necessarily the best site for a quarter mile district of 500 acres. And so I think to our best ability, where we can help look at that larger scale, we'll be more successful. And Sunrail's been doing that. So Sunrail has some early projects that have come online, but for each of those Sunrail stations, there's a plan that looks at the quarter mile and tries to figure out how those connections can take place. And then to advance that, Sunrail's brought in a TOD facilitator, if you will, which is Tim Jackson and the larger AECOM contingent now, formerly Gladden Jackson, to help look at that larger picture. So, and it's difficult because, again, I think the local governments are so hungry for development right now. You don't want to lose the project, but at the same time, if it's a 20-year investment, then making those connections are what's going to open up the potential for everything else around it.
In some cases, I think, too, with the Sunrail, the decision about where the station is going is dependent on, where facilities already exist and trying to capitalize on those, as opposed to where would you really like it to be that would serve the greatest need. So.
I grew up in the Orlando market. I'm really familiar with the locations that the proposed stops are. I'll let them study specific site plans. But once you get out of downtown on the Winter Park corridor, it's generally single-family home development outside of those proposed stops. So I think that has led to, unfortunately, some of the parking needs, because they're going to need the ridership to obviously support the infrastructure, and they need people who live, 3, 4, 5 miles away to be able to, unfortunately, come to park because they're just talking about the law.
I think the hospital sites are also big opportunities of where you could have more real, transformative kind of development.
I know Frank had a question. Frank?
If you're looking at the ultimate build-out scenario, this is kind of for Ken and Greg and Mike. If you're looking at the ultimate build-out scenario and something Kim said about you don't want to get stuck with something that's less than what you want, but the other side of that is that the market doesn't support the 5-story building, that it'll support something more than a vacant lot.
Right.
Have you all devised any successional development strategies that can allow a 1- or 2-story building that's the right form so that it does build the place and the pedestrian orientation that you need, but allows the place to start building value until the market can support that being replaced with a 5- or 6- or 10-story building?
Yeah, all the plans that we have worked on, I think that, as Frank, as low as we've gone is 2 stories around the station. And then, but even with the parking garages, those, and any parking lots, those parking lots are typically designed so they can fill in as streets. How they're designed, so they're easily filled in with buildings, and then a parking garage. Because until, we don't have the densities of Europe, we don't have the densities yet. But I can even imagine in Washington, some of those places, those parking garages, maybe not going away, but actually being buildings, eventually being converted. And even when we're designing parking garages, we try and do it with flat roofs and to make sure that, and high enough so that one day those garages can evolve into something else. So, and every plan we do, has a 50 to 100 year sort of look, so that over time those things evolve as we change, as we live. Because right now, the way we're living, I would suggest to you we live sort of like Neanderthals, a little uncivilized. How we live and organize ourselves in the landscape is a little uncivilized today. But when we design plans, it's for way out in the future, so they can be converted.
You have to think about where we are in our life stage.
Right.
We're gangly adolescents, but we will
Right.
grow up.
Florida is the adolescent state, so.
Yeah. But we have a lot of opportunity.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I look
We'll
at
get
it
there,
optimistically.
like,
I have
we're
young
teenagers,
kids, so.
So, you have a
That-
question?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, with regard to the FEC and the Florida development, I flew in here from Westchester County and just brought my bicycle on in a backpack on the plane, and then put it together when I got out and rode to the conference.
Cool.
What were you making? I haven't heard really the word bicycle mentioned in terms of like bicycle train integration, which in California, the Amtrak California system now exceeds the number of riders that Excel provides on a similar, mileage proportion on the Northeast corridor. And 10% of the ridership, for example, on the Capital Corridor is actually like 1 out of every 10 riders is someone like riding their bicycle up to the train, boarding the train with their bicycle, and then getting to their final destination.
That's a good point, actually.
Tri-
Tri-Rail has some accommodation for that. The current commuter rail, not enough. When we were riding bikes, actually, in California, Northern California, we had to wait for 3 buses. We rode too far. I didn't feel like riding back from Monterey to Carmel. We had to wait for 3 buses until there was an empty bicycle rack for it. Yeah, so that's a good point.
And Tri-Rail,
Yeah, that's a good point.
Tri-Rail has bikes on boards.
Yeah.
They just put in a free,
fantastic.
they just put on a
Okay.
free bike locker program,
Yeah.
which I don't think they've had enough good press. They did a great job and found grant dollars to make it happen, which is phenomenal. And what you find at Tri-Rail stations is the bike racks are typically overloaded, so they're now
Yeah.
increasing the amount of bike storage space, which is great. On the FEC corridor, one of the very optimistic aspects of the FEC is to run a rails with trails along the entire length of the FEC. The FEC is almost 100 feet wide consistently through 85 miles. There are some pinch points, though, which make that tough. But the plans for the FEC corridor include a 10-foot trail through the stretch of the corridor. The good thing about the FEC, though, is that it's really enmeshed in the urban fabric where Dixie Highway is usually within a block or 2. And Dixie's bike conditions are pretty good. With another hat, I'm also working with the 7 MPOs on a regional greenways and trails plan that will interconnect the bicycle pedestrian plans, as well as greenways and blueways for kayak launches and those to tie all that together. That actually is being developed as part of, I mentioned the long-range transportation plans, actually the regional long-range transportation plans. They're in the 2040 horizon now, and those entities are all developing greenways and trails plans that look out to 2040. So the planning is in place. The facilities always are catching up, but the regional perspective on getting those facilities that can take you from home to work, long-distance commute, are there, as well as connecting with the transit facilities. So it's a question of priorities.
Sure. I just might mention that in California, Metrolink, there's Caltrain up in San Jose to San Francisco, and then down in like a 400-mile train system in LA.
In Los Angeles, the red, the gold.
This is Metrolink, and they I understand just like within the last 6 months, they've had like onboard parking where there's a couple slots in each train, but they're now like, or the new cars that are coming in like have, they're actually bike cars, so it's like the capacity is like really bumped
Better.
out. And it's almost like I see the area that, and then one advantage of this area is similar to like Orange County in the LA region. It's a flat plain, so it's like pretty easy for cycling.
Mhm.
If you do have some of the bike lane accommodations on US 1, you call it Dixie Highway. They're like down in Boynton Beach, and so yeah, I think there's a lot of potential.
No,
I have a
that's good.
follow-up point
We'll-
for you when we're done, because we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, we're out of
But I have
time,
a lot of
actually.
bike information for you
And
on
as
this
long
FEC
as, I
project.
guess, Greg and Kim will stay, I'm sure they'll answer questions. Yes, Frank?
Answer a question.
Yeah.
Brass tacks, is it time to start buying property around the FEC station?
Well, if FEC is going to put $1 billion, right, and within about 30 days, FEC has told us that they should start to have their investment grade analysis, their preliminary costs, and ridership numbers with a fare structure, right? So if FEC is going to be cooking with grease on getting that project to happen, which means plans done by fourth quarter, under construction in 2013, and completed by probably second quarter 2014, the answer is, those are some pretty hot spots.
And
So-
if you look at Greg's numbers, it's,
That's the high-speed rail portion. Like you showed a local line that ran as well, like that had all these little stops up and down these coasts. That was
The
a
commuter.
high-speed corridor as well, the commuter.
Well, the high-speed, go ahead.
well, there is, the high-speed rail went someplace else. It was supposed to go between Orlando and Tampa.
No.
The express train, the FEC train, with the 3 spots to get you really from Miami to Orlando. That's what Kim's talking about. There'll be 3 stops: Fort Lauderdale, Miami, West Palm's lucky enough to get a stop. Others are fighting for stops in the northern counties on the way up to Cocoa, and then across from Cocoa to Orlando. And there's even plans to go further. There's plans to go to Tampa and then up to Jacksonville as well. So
Does that track exist between Cocoa and?
No.
No.
Orlando? So
No.
that needs to be-
there's right-of-way for...
Well, there's a couple pieces to
Yeah.
that one. One is that FEC has looked at the market numbers, and with that number of stops, with 4 stops, it's a 3-hour trip from Orlando to Miami, and that's really the benchmark for them. So the way I look at it, it's a first layer of service, and after that, there's all sorts of opportunity. The track they're looking at to connect in Cocoa probably is going to be 528, that's my guess. When I look at the map, that sure
right
looks
away.
like the line. That brings the station to just north of Orlando International. You'd then be able to connect the Sunrail and cover all of Central Florida. The next layer of service is Amtrak service or other high-speed express that can run. And FEC has been very specific that their project does not at all preclude any of the other passenger rail projects that are underway. In fact, their slide lists all the projects that are moving through time. So they are. I mean, really, that's how you make it work, is to have more choices.
It's going to take a while. We basically dismantled the rail system in this country, and we're getting back. And Frank, in fact, if you look at what Greg, sort of the elevation and some of the land values, I don't think it needs to be on the railroad track. I think if you're within a quarter mile or a few blocks.
Yeah, just
those
has to
properties
also
are
make
fine.
sure it also makes market sense, that it's also has some strong market fundamentals behind it, because not all places experience the same uplift, but
Right.
some do.
So, all right, we got to go. You're welcome. We have to get out of the room. Thank you.